Hi everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there to learn how to find, maintain, and grow long term sponsorship relationships. If you're interested in finding out more, please visit the Vaucher Analytics website at www.vaucheranalytics.com and use the navigation links at the top right hand of the screen. Okay, so today I am back with the second in a two-part series covering what I think that racing is going to look like in the next 100 years. In the first part, which I'll link to in the show notes, we covered everything from sustainability in motorsport to VR and how that's going to totally change the pipeline in the high-level motorsport, as well as create, paradoxically, some interesting challenges for its survival. And today in part two, I just want to jump right into something I did touch on in the first part, which was the cost of racing. Because as you can imagine, as racing will advance, it will become more expensive. And this is one area I don't think is going to change very much from the previous 100 years of motorsport. It's always going to cost a lot of money to operate at a high level and put on a good show. So I just want to jump in to part number 5 of 7. Again, I covered the first 4 in the first part of the series, but part 5 is asking the question, who actually pays to race in 21-25? Now, as I said, racing will still be very expensive in 100 years in the 22nd century. So the real question is not whether racing is costly, it's how anyone justifies paying for it in a world where attention is fragmented, entertainment is infinite, and simulated racing is just as compelling as the real thing, and perhaps more. Some of the justification will come from road car revenue. I covered that in the first part of the series. Manufacturers will still need racing as their marketing engine, their cultural anchor, and their differentiator in a hyper commoditized automotive market. Some justification will also come from fan driven income. The teams that survive will be the ones who treat fans as a base they cultivate, not a crowd they rent, with their own platforms, products, and events, and narratives that generate recurring revenue, not one off bursts. And this gets into what the real structural shift will be, and that will be sponsorship. Traditional title deals, such as the 9-figure mega deals of early 21st century Formula One, will no longer make economic sense. The broad catch all value proposition that carried sponsorship for decades will erode. In a world where audiences are atomized into thousands of micro interests, no sponsor will be able to justify paying for a mass audience that barely exists. Now, I could come up with another scenario that's very typical in a lot of science fiction worlds where really everything's actually been hyper agglomerated. There's only a couple of corporations that manage everything. That's fine. Sure, but even in that case, you have to convince that same very small handful of companies that motorsport is worth sponsoring. And in a world where they monopolize everything, why would that be the case? So I'm sticking with the hypothesis that actually the world is going to be hyper fractured and everyone can retreat into their own bubble of brands. But even in the alternate case, it's still hard to see the sponsorship model holding up. Having said that, it won't necessarily disappear. By 21-25, the classic sponsorship model won't actually disappear, but I do think it'll become a minority contributor rather than the backbone of team budgets. I just can't see this routine of basically dialing for dollars every season carrying on, especially with the tools that teams and drivers should have at their disposal in 21-25. Sponsors, on their end, will seek precision. Projects, activations, content pieces, technology, and community initiatives that directly target the micro segments that they're looking to focus on. So again, if everyone is hyper focused, you should be able to match a brand to that very focused slice of consumers, and you should be able to do it exactly. These will be true long-term partnerships that provide supplementary but not necessarily mandatory revenues to race teams. And that leaves teams with a simple, unforgiving mandate. Relevance must be built, not assumed. This is the philosophy I put forth in another article, which I'll link to in the show notes. And I put forth this idea of a motorsport relevance pyramid, which assumes that teams must define what they stand for, own their distribution, both digital and physical. They must turn drivers into multi-platform human assets, and this human side is going to become more and more important as technology moves forward. And they must structure sponsor programs that evolve over time rather than reset every season. It is much, I want to say, easier to keep happy a sponsor and keep them on board than it is to constantly have to sell yourself to new sponsors. So in 21-25, the teams that remain on the grid will be the ones that have transformed WeGo Racing into a defensible business model, not a heroic fundraising exercise, but rather a stable system of identity, fan belonging, and targeted commercial partnerships. In this next section, I really want to jump into what most people would see as the meat of a series on the next 100 years of racing, and that's technology. Now, to do this for every series would be impossible, so I'm going to talk in generalities, but if any of this piques your interest, please do send me questions or comments, and I'd be happy to delve into this more for a specific series if there's enough listener interest to justify that. So let's talk about technology, the next century of performance. Now, even though I'm not going to go into a specific series, I will split this up into several parts to keep things manageable. Every era of racing has been shaped by whatever technology was capable of pushing the limit at the time. For instance, the front engines of the 1950s, the rise of aero on rear engine layouts in the 60s and 70s, ground effect and carbon fiber in the 80s, hybrid systems in the 2000s, and now a move towards electrification today. But the next century won't be a linear continuation, rather a philosophical shift. Let's be clear, progress will be radical, and I don't think if you saw the 100-year car today that it would look anything like what we're racing. So the progress is going to be there. But I do want to make clear one fundamental boundary constraint here, and that's that the driver must remain the final decision maker. So when I went through this thought exercise of trying to imagine what technology would be like in 100 years, there were two paths. Either I went completely crazy to get attention, or I stayed reasonable to try and make my projections valid. And to do that, I wanted to rest on several principles that have been in place since the history of motorsport, and certainly since it's been sanctioned seriously. And one of those has been the driver remaining in control. So I'll explain that more as I go along, but really that is the foundational principle for all of my projections moving ahead. Across propulsion, aero, and manufacturing, 21-25's cars will be vastly more advanced, but the overarching theme is that all this technology exists to serve the human, not replace them. So I want to cover the first obvious path of where I could go with this, and that's AI. And AI will be powerful everywhere except for on track. AI will transform engineering, simulation, setup, and safety, but it will remain almost irrelevant on track, at least as far as the driver controlling the car. The FIA has been consistent for decades. Anything that substitutes human judgment is very quickly banned. Active suspension, automated traction aids, adaptive aerodynamics, gone. Every time. The sport protects the primacy of human decision making because racing loses its meaning the moment software becomes the differentiator. This is why autonomous racing, like that featured in the league being developed in Abu Dhabi, will remain a technology platform, not a replacement for motorsport. Yes, the cars will be astonishingly fast, capable of superhuman precision. But that's the point. It's superhuman when racing is about being human. Manufacturers will use this type of technology to showcase software prowess, and engineers will certainly learn a lot. But as a spectator sport, it's missing the essential ingredient, a human choosing to take a risk and then surpassing the limits of what seems possible. In other words, superhuman is really only compelling when it's human at its very base. So this is the non-negotiable core of racing, and 21-25's regulation will guard it as fiercely as they guard safety. Now let's talk propulsion, because this is always a subject guaranteed to get motor racing fans going. My hypothesis on this is that internal combustion doesn't die, it actually emerges luxurious. Here's what I mean by that. One of the great misconceptions in both motorsport and the automotive industry is that electrification kills combustion. The future isn't binary. The only reason it's viewed this way is because other, less developed technologies than ICE or internal combustion engines are only feasible today, and established motorsport fans are comfortable with what they know. In other words, of course, an internal combustion engine outperforms a straight electric one because ICE has been the dominant technology for a longer time. And of course, that is what people want to see because that is what they have always seen. But 100 years from now, when every technology is developed and when new generations of fans have entirely different points of view on the world, that will be a very different paradigm. one in which there is a coexistence of technologies, ICE, electric, hydrogen, hybrids, and new systems we haven't even yet invented, each powering racing formats optimized to suit their strengths and adapted for different audiences. Why though? Well, because racing is both entertainment and marketing. For EV and hydrogen manufacturers, the track proves technological credibility and breaks the appliance perception of an automobile, especially for Chinese brands building global reputations, exactly as Japanese companies did in the 20th century. For luxury manufacturers, combustion becomes what mechanical watches are today: emotionally charged, artisanal, mechanical theater. ICE survives not as commuting tech, but as an experience, complete with sound, vibration, heat, and drama, precisely because it no longer exists in everyday life. In an ironic twist, the same combustion engines that evoked images of greasy garages in the 20th century will be admired like the finest mechanical movements in a watch in the 22nd century. By 2125, combustion engines will not be dead, they will be premium objects of desire fueled by entirely renewable fuels. Now let's talk about another hot button issue, which will be aerodynamics. And my point of view on this is that they will be more efficient than ever, but again, never autonomous. Aero evolution by 2125 will be defined by attention. Engineers will want adaptive efficiency and perfect stability. Regulators will continue insisting that no system can think for the driver, and history tells us who wins that fight. So Aero in 2125 will be modeled via computational tools capable of replicating real-world physics to 100% accuracy. They'll be built from materials with extremely low drag coefficients. They'll be tailored to every track using ultra-fast, ultra-cheap micro-batch manufacturing, and they will be strictly non-adaptive unless triggered by the driver. And interestingly enough, with the rule change coming up in 2026, we see an example of that. There will be movable aerodynamic surfaces, and the driver will have control of those. If anything, some series may swing in the opposite direction: less downforce, more mechanical grip, and more human control, reviving the pure driving challenge of mid-century motorsport. And that is also something that we're seeing today. So, for instance, Australia's V8 supercars relatively recently introduced their third gen car, and that generates a very low amount of downforce. I think the number is something like 140 kilograms. But alternatively, some of you may have been following J.R. Hildebrand's. He's an ex IndyCar driver, and he has a project called Blackbird 66, which is really interesting. And you can find the link to that in the source article, which of course is linked in the show notes. Now, I've touched on manufacturing in the aero section, but I want to go more specifically into this and say that by 2125, manufacturing and materials will be built and grown. By 2125, manufacturing will undergo and will have undergone a monumental transformation. Motorsport at that time moves from machining, molding, and layering to full on-site additive manufacturing of structural components, self-healing composites that repair microfractures in real time, adaptive monocoques that can be reconfigured or built in mere hours, maybe minutes for specific circuits. I think there will be embedded strain sensing neural networks in every major structure, and there will be near total recyclability of the chassis and bodywork. All of this is to say that a race car will not be assembled. Rather, it will be printed, shaped, cured, grown, or extruded, and continuously updated. The result is a machine that is lighter, stronger, safer, more sustainable, faster to produce, faster to repair, and infinitely refinable. Now, I mentioned safety, and this is a key point. I have not left it to last because it is the least important, not at all. But in the chronological chain, we end up with what I think safety is going to look like at the end of the 21st century and, of course, the beginning of the 22nd. And to be clear, I am not a doctor. I have no medical training. But as an engineer, and with an analogy of the body being basically a mechanical system with parts all working together, this is my input of where I think safety is going to be going. So what I'm titling this section is Safety, the Era of Near Certain Survivability. And here's what I mean by that. The racing cars of 2125 will look radically different from today's machines, yet their safety philosophy will be the same one that reshaped modern motorsport over the last 30 years, roughly the period beginning after the deaths of Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna. Every foreseeable crash must be survivable. That is the guiding principle. Now, as performance rises, risk rises with it. So even though we can have a fixed goal, which is that you maximize survivability, it's always a moving goalpost because you have to adapt to the ever-increasing capabilities of the cars and drivers. That tension never disappears. But by 2125, the industry will finally reach the end state it has been crawling towards since the advent of carbon tubs, Hans devices, safer barriers, halo structures, and modern helmets. A world where serious injury is rare and fatality is nearly mathematically impossible. By 2125, that guiding principle that every foreseeable crash must be survivable will be faced with technologies that turn the cockpit into an adaptive protection system, one in which the driver is almost a whole, a part. So the cockpit must become, and I believe will become, an adaptive crash organism. The carbon monocoque of 2025 is a blunt tool by 22nd century standards. By 2125, the cockpit will be a multi-layered energy management system comprising smart composites that locally flex to route forces around the body and vital organs, fluidic crash channels beneath the driver that disperse impact loads like controlled shock waves. So this is like the crumple zones in a car taken to the next level. Also, there will be self-stiffening structures that harden on demand exactly where and when they need to. And there will be thermal membranes that neutralize fire instantly, if fire is even possible with future fuels and engineering. So a crash is no longer something the chassis passively absorbs, it's something the cockpit actively responds to. Now, this is, of course, all in the event that a crash happens, but what if we could predict them before anything actually occurred? So the major leap forward will not be reaction, it will be anticipation. By 2125, car to track, and car to driver networks will evaluate collision probabilities thousands of times per second, making it appear as if these systems can predict the future when and if a crash does occur. Crashes will effectively begin before they physically occur, giving systems the split, maybe even full seconds required to reposition, restrain, or protect the driver. And what I have in mind here are things like exoskeletal race suits that apply counter pressure during violent decelerations, pre-tension harnesses that lock the driver into the safest posture possible, and that will be calculated on the fly before and as a crash is happening. Also, there could be helmet stabilization actuators that prevent rotational brain trauma. There could also be automatic circulation support to prevent blackout or blood pooling, and there will be instant thermal protection for fire scenarios if those even happen. The moment a crash becomes likely, the driver's entire safety ecosystem preloads itself. And we see this in consumer cars of not just today, but years past with things like pre-tensioning safety belts. So again, this is that concept taken to the nth level with the benefit of time and technology and research. Now, if a crash has happened, what happens next? Here, I'm thinking of immediate medical support with treatment starting even before the marshals arrive. In the cockpit, real-time biometrics will be monitored continuously during the normal course of a race. Things like brain activity, cardiac rhythm, blood oxygenation, muscular strain, heat load, and concussion signatures, or at least indications that there may be negative contacts to the head and to the brain. So if a crash occurs, onboard systems, with the benefit of this information that's already being captured, will begin intervention automatically. For instance, CPR via the race suit, brain cooling protocols if brain trauma is predicted and or detected, and emergency oxygenation if needed. The rescue crew then arrives not to diagnose, but to continue treatment already underway, with a full medical summary and course of action autonomously predetermined for them and also automatically sent to the closest medical facility. So the end state of all of this is that death becomes theoretically possible, but practically absent. It would be naive to say motorsport will eliminate death because so-called corner cases will always exist in any field. But by 2125, the risk profile will resemble that of commercial aviation. It's theoretically present, but practically imperceptible. Drivers will still feel fear and anxiety. They'll still push beyond the limit. But the tragedies that define the first century of racing will be rarities that future generations only read about rather than witness. This is the future of safety in motorsport, a world where humans still take risks at the edge of control, but almost never pay for it with their lives, and thank goodness for that. So to close this up, I want to reassure you that despite all of these changes, the old adage, or at least my paraphrasing of the old adage, will still hold. The more racing will change, the more it will stay the same. For all the speculation about propulsion revolutions, immersive simulations, sustainability imperatives, and evolving business models, the truth is simpler than all of it. In 2125, racing will still look like racing. It will look like a lot of brave people trying to go faster and outmaneuver the people next to them. The world around it may transform beyond recognition, but the core spectacle of a human being balancing courage, judgment, and instinct at the edge of control will remain the beating heart of motorsport. The environment supporting that spectacle will be radically more advanced, absolutely. Tracks might generate electricity as cars drive on them. Calendars will be shaped as much by environmental impact as by tradition. Stewarding will rely on gigantic data sets collected and interpreted automatically in fractions of a second rather than debate with other stewards. Fans will be immersed physically and digitally in ways we can barely imagine today. But these innovations won't replace racing, they will protect it, wrapping the familiar competition in a 22nd century ecosystem built to justify its existence, but go beyond that by amplifying its appeal. And that's the real promise of motorsport's next 100 years. Not that it becomes something alien, but that it remains something recognizably human, even if everything else around it does in fact take on those extraterrestrial qualities from the point of view of 2025. The formats that survived the last century, such as endurance battles, hill climbs, rallies thundering through forests and mountain passes, well, they'll still be with us, just different. The machines will evolve, the world will evolve, but the thrill of watching someone wrestle a car at the limit will always be the same. And that's a wrap, summarizing 100 years of future motorsport in two parts of the Return on Racing podcast. If you enjoyed this and want more insights, I'd encourage you to please check out the Return on Racing newsletter and consider signing up for it. This is where I periodically deliver insights in a short format to you, with the idea being that you can apply those directly to your motorsport operations in a very quick and direct way. If this sounds interesting, please visit the front page of the Vaucher Analytics website. That's where you'll find the sign-up form, and I'll link to it directly in the show notes. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with me here on Return on Racing, and I really look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.